Welcome, everybody, to session 2 of our healthcare equity series. We're joined today by AJ, who's coming back to speak with us on our second topic. I'm not going to take too much away from her because I'd like for her to say hello and introduce our second topic. So with that, I'm going to hand it off and let her get things started. But thank you all for coming. We are really grateful to have all of you here and joining us for this educational series.
All right. Yeah, I am a little surprised at how many folks are here, but this is excellent. So welcome to the second session. I'm really excited to be back. I have probably been working on this presentation up until like 5 minutes ago. So that's just how it goes. Okay, so again, quick intro. Last session we were talking about the mothers of gynecology and J. Miriam Sims, and this is me at the Mothers of Gynecology giving a talk. So again, AJ Musewe, she, her pronouns, founder of With the Reverence Co-op. And if folks are looking to hear more of my nonsense, Papers for My Acres is a podcast that I did with a friend of mine that's out. And also you can find me at AJ and the Beanies on social ranting about something historical or whatever. Okay, so again, ground rules. Just want to make sure everybody knows. Oh, I think somebody's not on mute. Let me see. Okay. So again, ground rules. This is a no knowledge shaming space. I'm not interested in making you feel bad for what you don't know. We all were not taught history accurately. Questions are highly encouraged. I do not have a monopoly of knowledge, but I do like research. So if I can't tell you the answer right then and there, I will make sure to get the answer to you some way. And again, no topic familiarity is needed to participate, just curiosity. All right, let's start with our path today. So we're going to start with healthcare post-Civil War. Last time we talked, our first conversation we had was before the Civil War, so now we're going to go after. I also want to introduce something I called instant noodles. When I'm thinking about something or pondering something, I usually say I'm noodling on it. So there's going to be a couple opportunities during our time together for folks to engage and to kind of present their thoughts during these instant noodle moments. We're going to look at the origins of the eugenics movement and how that led to a court case in 1927 that drastically shifted reproductive rights for decades in this country. And around that same time, there was also the Tuskegee Study, which we'll look into, and then have a final conversation from a video with the author of this book, Dr. Uche Blackstock. And she's going to talk to us kind of about how the academic medical biases are baked into the way that you go through medical school. And then we'll do questions, discussions, resources, and then get to session 3. Okay. So Juneteenth is a couple of days away, so I wanted to start there. Now, I don't know about you, but I was taught that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the enslaved folks in 1863. Yes and no. So to make a really, really long story less long, the Emancipation Proclamation was a military tactic that Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet used because they realized that the Confederates were using slave labor as part of their campaign against the Union, right? And so the Emancipation Proclamation essentially said if you, as an enslaved person, are in a Confederate controlled area and you abscond or you run away and you get yourself to a Union controlled area, then you are free. But if you are not in a Union controlled area, then you are technically still enslaved because slavery was still around. So now the Civil War, oh, and the Emancipation Proclamation is how we got black regiments during the Civil War. So if any of you have ever seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, where he has that single tear cry, that's about the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, which was a really famous black regiment. And Frederick Douglass had two sons in the Massachusetts 54th named Charles and Lewis. So like it's a big deal. Now, Civil War ends in 1865, and what ends up happening is a lot of the battles during the Civil War were like Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, that kind of thing. So when planters realized that the Civil War was coming into their area, they moved their enslaved property to areas that were less populated, which meant a lot of them went to Texas. Now, after the end of the Civil War, you had generals like Gordon Granger here who would ride with his troops into these really out of the way towns in the South. One, looking for Confederate holdouts to flush them out, and two, to also let people know that the war has ended. If you were to look at a map of Texas, Galveston is all the way down to the tippy at the bottom. So these folks had no idea that the Civil War was even over. So as he's looking around, he gets up on a balcony and he reads General Order Number 3. Now, this says the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, so he's talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former master and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes between employer and hired labor. This is the part that always pisses me off every time I read this part of my language. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. If you were not getting paid to do work, the person who enslaved you is most likely not going to pay you. So freedmen decided that they were going to go off and try and figure out what was going on. But our first instant noodle. So you can unmute and share your thoughts, or you can put your thoughts in the chat. I have the chat up so I can read. What do you think were some of the biggest healthcare issues present during and after the Civil War? And here are some options for you. A lack of adequate healthcare for formerly enslaved people, rampant disease and illness with no public health infrastructure, or overcrowded hospital flooded with Civil War veterans. So folks can unmute or put their answers in the chat. You can just put A, B, or C in the chat. Or if you have a different idea, you can also put that in the chat. I'm gonna give you guys like 13 seconds in case anybody wants to say it. Okay, got one answer, all of the above. Nice. We got
I
somebody
would
else.
think A would be a pretty big issue, lack of adequate health care.
Yep, very big.
I
All.
would I would agree with A as well. That seems to be like a really big one for me. Looks like there's a lot pouring into the chat right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also a lack of nutrition, absolutely.
I think especially because a lot of those potentially injured Civil War veterans were formerly enslaved people, they kind of fit into A too, or there's overlap at least.
Nice. Awesome. Okay, yeah, everybody's right. The answer is all of them. Because everything leads to everything, right? Enslaved people were already not getting the best health care. There was rampant disease and illness, and we all know there wasn't exactly the most sanitary back then. And also, the hospitals were overcrowded with Civil War veterans. So it just kind of created the perfect storm, right? So now, what do 4 million people who have been freed do with no resources, right? Like, what happens? We get introduced to the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was enacted by Congress in March of 1865, prior to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and it essentially was trying to figure out a way to assimilate all of these people who were formerly property but now are considered, well, technically they're not considered citizens, but they're not considered property anymore. This also include poor white folks. Because if you do not have access to extra capital, you could not send your children to school. You could not go to school. So a lot of poor white folks also could not read. And the freedmen schools were an opportunity for them to also gain access to education. Like we said, the war caused a lot of diseases, right? People were not washing their hands before they stuck their hands in people's bloody wounds and all that stuff. It just, germs. But in addition to that, there were already all these biases about illnesses that Black folks and formerly enslaved folks had that were already baked into the way that people were engaging with now these free Black folks. In 1851, a physician named Samuel Cartwright put out a report that was called The Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. And he coined a term called drapetomania. And drapetomania was a psychological condition that afflicted Black people prior to the start of the Civil War that caused them to run away from slavery. I just want you to hear that again. Drapetomania is a mental illness that causes Black enslaved people to run away from slavery. Okay. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau also did something else, right? They created a medical division because, again, a lot of Black folks did not have access to healthcare and they were getting sick. And so they needed to figure out what to do and how to treat them. And so hospitals all over the South hired physicians like Dr. Lee Crumpler. Now, Dr. Crumpler is awesome, right? She was born free in Delaware in 1831, and she went to the New England Female Medical College, becoming the first Black woman to receive a degree of medical doctor in the country in 1864. So we're still in the Civil War has not ended yet. And she receives her doctorate and she goes to work at the Freedmen's Bureau in Virginia. Now, After working there for decades, she realizes, okay, so the knowledge that enslaved people have is not enough, or formerly enslaved people have, is not enough to make sure to, I guess, kind of offset the lack of adequate health care. So this book was created to help them be able to take care of themselves because they knew that they were not going to get access to healthcare because no access equals higher risk, which means more blame. And the people who were taking the most advantage of that was a group called the Redeemers. Now, after the Civil War, you had a period called Reconstruction, which, depending on which historian you talk to, between 1865 and 1877. And that's where we had a lot of progress for Black folks. We had Black men in office, almost 2,000 Black men, who many were formerly enslaved, were in Congress. And a lot of people were going back to school and learning how to read. And so these diseases and these supposed mental illnesses were justification that freedmen were allergic to freedom, just justifying Jim Crow. And that was done by Professor William Archibald Dunning, who was a Columbia University professor, right? And so many of those hospitals ended up shutting down, which is why a book like what, Dr. Crumpler wrote was really important, because those hospitals and those clinics that the freedmen set up started to shut down, which meant a lot of people were left without adequate health care or access to any health care at all. So in that same period of time, we also had mass immigration of folks from other parts of the world coming into America. Now, the quote unquote, if you're a Harry Potter fan, right? They have the purebloods like Malfoy and all them, but you got the purebloods like the Weasleys. We are talking about the Malfoy type of purebloods, okay? And they felt like all of these immigrants that were coming in were going to mess up the pure blood that was around, that the Aryans decided that their blood was so much better than everybody's. And so you get this kind of idea of eugenics. So this is a quick video that's going to give us the origins of eugenics, and then we'll go from there.
Since ancient Greece, there have been efforts to control human populations via reproduction, retaining some traits and removing others. But in the 19th century, the discovery of evolution and genetics inspired a new scientific movement dedicated to this endeavor. In 1883, British scientist Sir Francis Galton named this idea eugenics, drawing from the Greek word for to be well born. This wave of modern eugenicists included prominent scientists and progressive reformers who believed they could improve society by ensuring that only desirable traits were passed down. However, their definition of what traits were and were not desirable was largely determined by the prejudices of their era. Entire categories of people were considered unfit for reproduction, including immigrants, people of color, and people with disabilities. Meanwhile, their ideal genetic standard reflected the movement's members, white Europeans of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. As the influence of eugenics spread in the early 20th century, many countries restricted immigration and outlawed interracial unions. These measures to improve so-called racial hygiene were taken to their horrific conclusion in Nazi Germany. The Nazi eugenics campaign systematically killed millions of Jews, as well as individuals from other groups, including Roma, gay men, and people with disabilities. Outside their extreme brutality, however, Nazi eugenic policies reflected similar standards across the globe. Throughout the mid-20th century, many countries enacted eugenics policies, and governments in Sweden, Canada, and Japan forcibly sterilized thousands of individuals. Sterilization was exceptionally common in the U.S. From 1907 to 1979, U.S. policies enforced the sterilization of over 60,000 people, with 32 states passing laws that mandated sterilization for men and women deemed mentally defective. This label was typically applied based on superficial mental health diagnoses and the results of IQ tests, which were linguistically and culturally biased against most immigrant populations. These racist standards were particularly problematic in California. From 1920 to 1945, Latina women were 59% more likely to be sterilized than other women, and the rate of sterilizations in California was incredibly high. This single state performed over 1/3 of the country's sterilization operations.
Okay, well, California was progressive. Wow. Okay, so real quick, another instant noodle. With this start, can you tell which of the following examples could lead to eugenics-like thinking? Forcing women in prison to get sterilized in exchange for shorter sentences, claiming that women are too emotional or unstable to make decisions about their own bodies, assuming that Black patients have higher pain tolerances, or believing that people with disabilities should be sterilized so they don't pass on quote unquote bad genes. Feel free to unmute, put your thoughts in the chat, whatever feels most comfortable. Again, give y'all like 15, 20 seconds to see if anybody wants to participate. There's no wrong answers. Look at you guys. I know that's
I'd
right.
say all of them, but I think D is the most like overt.
I like that language.
Yeah, I was gonna say all as well. Uh, it also looks like D's very popular in the chat.
Mm-hmm. You know what? If I could give all of you guys stars, I would, because this is excellent. You are all correct. Yes, all of it, right? All of it is a way to slide right into eugenics thinking. Now, in 1912, a study came out that was absolutely foolish. Okay. It was about this guy named Martin Killiak. And essentially, a eugenicist named Henry Goddard supposedly traced 480 of Martin's descendants because Martin was born as the illegitimate son of a feeble minded girl. And what he wanted to prove with this study, what Henry Goddard wanted to prove with the study, is if you had a child with the correct type of person who was not feeble-minded, who did not have these quote unquote bad traits, excuse me, then you would have progeny that are better off, right? So he splits it into two, and he says this is the kind of family that Martin would have if he had a respectable and successful, intelligent wife, so a worthy Quakeress, as he put it. And if he had a baby with a quote unquote old barmaid, then he would have all these children that would be deemed criminals, imbeciles, and social burdens. And this study was really, really popular, essentially because it framed poverty, disability, and crime as traits that you can inherit, and that correct quote unquote precautions would lead to fitter families. Yeah, right. And so what did this lead to? It led to fitter family events all over the country, like this one in 1924 in Georgia. You would bring essentially as many of your family members as you could, and you would be judged, poked, prodded. They would check your teeth for alignment. They would check your baby for, you know, everything and anything, literally from your grandma all the way down to the babies they would check. And then also there was campaigns around, like this one from North Carolina, from the Human Betterment League, where they would be passing out pamphlets essentially telling people that you do not want a feeble-minded person in your family. Oh, I'm going to pause here. I see a hand up from Joe, I think.
Yeah, so we see a lot of just language in today's political discourse that, talks a lot about like immigrants being criminals and things like that. That what you just described, just kind of a little light bulb went off in my head, and I was like, oh, that's where that comes from.
Yeah, you're hearing a lot of the same languages that build some of the policies and behaviors that we're seeing the country enact now. And that's why I try to tell folks a lot of this information was hidden from you. And so sometimes it sounds like, oh my God, I can't believe the country would say that, or I can't believe a politician would say that. But in actuality, they posted stuff like this and sent out mailers and such. So I really appreciate you making that connection. That's excellent. Okay. So the court case, right? The eugenics movement is on and popping, as the young kids like to say. So now you have 1927. This is Carrie Buck and her mother. And because her family was poor, they essentially rented out Carrie to do labor for another family. And while she was there, she was assaulted by the quote unquote foster brother, and she got pregnant. Now, they already wanted to find a test case. The state of Virginia wanted to find a test case to try and figure out how to essentially codify into law the eugenics laws, policies that they had in place. And so Carrie Buck was deemed the perfect test case as a way to protect society from poverty, disability, and degeneracy. And they had deemed her mother and her child feeble-minded. So you have 3 generations, supposedly, of feeble-minded folks. Now, the Bell in Buck v. Bell was Dr. John Bell, who at the time was the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded Folks, which is where they wanted to put Carrie, right? And in the court case, the decision was 8-1 to uphold and to sterilize. But what Carrie did not know is that her defense team was working directly with Bell as a way to make sure that she lost her case. And then this ruling essentially led to over 60,000 sterilizations across the US, targeting poor people, disabled people, and people of color. Now, what was the craziest thing if that is not nuts enough, right? Listen to what Justice Wendell says. So Justice Oliver Wendell goes on to say this during the ruling. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, which is bananas to say, right? So by 1935, you had all these states that were either laws in effect or they were getting laws, they're working around it to try and figure out if you could essentially sterilize somebody because you deemed them unfit. Carrie Buck was then reinstitutionalized and sterilized by Dr. John Bell, which is nuts. And as we saw in the video, the eugenics movement influenced Nazi Germany and also the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which essentially limited folks who they deemed not good enough to enter the country. Does that sound like a ban that's probably happening right now? Yes, it does. But, history repeats itself. Now, just because you were poor doesn't mean that you were the only person that they were going after. They also went after rich people. This is Ann Cooper Hewitt. Her dad was Peter Cooper Hewitt, and he was an electrical inventor, had a bunch of money, and he passed away in 1921. When he passed away, he left 2/3 of his estate to Anne and 1/3 to her mom. Before she turned 21, when she turned 21, Anne officially, the inheritance was hers, right? So before she turned 21, her mother conspired with her doctors to deem her feeble-minded so she can take control over the money. Because after she turned 21, then there was nothing that the mom could do. And so she conspired with her doctors. She paid the 2 doctors $9,000 each to sterilize her because she said that Anne had erotic tendencies with bellhops and Negroes. She was just a free lady, okay? She believed in free love, and because of who she believed in free love with, she was deemed feeble-minded. Now, the case essentially showed people that even if you were wealthy or poor, because this is what now, not even a decade after the Buck v. Bell case. So essentially what they were showing is it didn't matter if you had all the money in the world, they could still come after you and sterilize you. And even though she settled out of court, she could never have children ever again. And that I wouldn't know what to say to my mom at that point, right? So what was also happening around that time? The Tuskegee Study. And the thing that I have realized that can be really disjointing is with the way we are taught history in school, especially in high school, is we're taught it in these chunks. And we don't realize that this is actually a layer cake, right? So when you cut down this layer cake, there's all these different things that are happening at the same time. And the eugenics study was happening while all of this was going on, while the Buck v. Bell cases and stuff were going on. So personally, I love Henry Louis Gates. I really just want him to be my uncle, but girl can dream. So he's going to introduce us to the Tuskegee syphilis trial, and then we're going to talk.
They were told they'd get treated for their bad blood. Instead, hundreds of poor black men became participants unknowingly in a shocking and truly shameful chapter of American medical history. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service launched an unethical research project to examine the effects of untreated syphilis. The project was called the Tuskegee Study because it recruited 600 black men living in Tuskegee, Alabama. Researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood, a term used locally to describe anything from fatigue to anemia. They promised the men free medical treatment if they participated. While 2/3 of the men in the study were confirmed to have syphilis, not one received proper treatment for the disease they had contracted.
So this was a study in which there was no consent on the part of those who were being studied, also deception on the part of the U.S. government.
When penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, Tuskegee researchers scandalously withheld the drug from the men in the study so that they could continue to chart the course of the disease when untreated. Many patients experienced damage to their vital organs and nervous systems. And for some, the lack of treatment led to death.
The great shame of the study is that the men thought that they were being treated. Treatment was withheld from them, even after it was very clear what kind of medical treatment would cure them of syphilis.
In 1972, an Associated Press article exposed the Tuskegee Study after one of the participants brought the story to a civil rights attorney. Only then, after 40 years, was the study brought to an end. The case was settled out of court for $10 million.
This long history of medical experimentation on African Americans creates a sense of distrust. A distrust of doctors and physicians, a distrust of medical care.
In 1997, President Bill Clinton formally apologized to the victims of the study. The president's apology was a welcome first step, but we still have a long way to go before the legacy of mistrust of science within the Black community is fully overcome.
Okay, so that's kind of the origin story of the Tuskegee study, but I don't want to take us to like the beginning, right? There was a doctor who was the director of the venereal disease division at the Public Health Services who actually was looking through data trying to figure out like where could he find a group of people that had a high rate of syphilis infection. And that's when he saw the numbers from Macon County in Alabama. So that's why he decided he was going to do that study. And here's the thing, they knew from the beginning that they did not care about the lives of these Black men. One of the PHS investigators, Dr. Oliver Wang, said, "We have no further interest in these patients until they die. If the colored population became aware that accepting free hospital care means a postmortem, every darky will leave Macon County." So, I mean, they went into this knowing that they were going to be harming people. And the study was supposed to be about 6 to 8 months, but it went on for 40 years, which is insane. And they were putting out reports, right? This is a syphilis study from 1933, and it says untreated syphilis study. So they knew that they were not treating these Black men on purpose. Now, quick check, right? Are you familiar with the term code switching? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers. I just want to make sure I know kind of where we are. So in the chat or unmute, you can say yes, no. It's fine if you're not, because we're about to explain it. But I just want to see.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So we've got a mixture. We've got a couple folks who are familiar, a couple folks who haven't heard this term. All good. So I'm going to explain why code switching is really, really important. Okay. Now, before we get there, we need to talk about Nurse Eunice Rivers. Eunice Rivers was a very, very key part of the success of the Tuskegee study. She was the primary point person for all of the patients, right? She visited homes, she arranged transports, pickups, tracked patients' responses to treatment. And so they trusted her. Now, later on, she defended her role, saying that she didn't know the full scope of the deception. And also, she essentially felt like this was the only way that these men could get constant health care in Jim Crow, Alabama, which is nuts, that this is the way that you would receive health care is by putting your life on the line. She passed away in 1986 at the age of 86. Now, this is why Eunice and code switching are so important. This is a clip from Mrs. Evers' Boys, which is included in the resources. The movie is on YouTube right now. And I just want you to pay attention to the difference in the way the white doctor talks to the Black men and the way Eunice talks to the Black men. And then we'll come back together.
Could you step out here for a second? Okay. Doctor?
Yes.
Would you excuse me? I'd like to speak with the men.
Sure, right ahead.
Gentlemen, there seems to be some confusion. Let me explain what we're checking for. There is a germ that infects the genital area, resulting in a temporary and painless, but highly contagious penile ulceration. Now, this ulceration will disappear as the disease becomes non-contagious or latent. And this latency can last for up to 30 years until finally the cardiovascular and nervous systems will disintegrate and collapse. Are there any questions?
say something? Sure. By frolicking too much, or maybe passed on from your mom and your daddy, you might get a really bad sew down below in your private parts. Then through that so a bug can crawl up inside of you and go to sleep for 20, 30 years or more. So it's not to hurt nobody but you. But when it wake up, you can't walk, you can't breathe, you can't think. That is bad blood. That's what we're checking to see if y'all got so we can get rid of it.
That makes sense.
You done. Come on. Willie.
That's code switching, right? We see the difference. The doctor, I mean, I understood everything the doctor said. Also, I've watched this movie a couple times. I understood everything the doctor said, but you can see the difference in the ways in which they respond to the white doctor versus the way they respond to Nurse Eunice. And so because she was able to talk like them and be kind of a translator for the both, they put a lot of trust into her. And she was the reason why a lot of them stayed in the study, okay? Now, let's get to 1972. 1972 was a horrible year for people. My goodness, it was a bad year for folks. So again, the study was exposed by this epidemiologist, Dr. Peter Buxton in San Francisco, because he heard a rumor that a doctor was reprimanded by the federal government for giving a patient penicillin. That patient was no longer in Alabama. He had gone up to a completely different state and he was feeling sick. He went to the doctor. They tested him. They're like, oh yeah, you got syphilis. Like, let's give you some penicillin, go about your business. And then the federal government found out because records, and also Nurse Eunice was keeping track of where these patients were. And this guy, Peter, was like, something's not right. I don't understand what's going on. So he writes report after report after report, and nobody would listen to him, right? Nobody would listen to him. So he decided he was going to have a conversation with one of his friends who happens to be a reporter for the Associated Press. And then everything blows up. Then all of a sudden they want to have congressional hearings and all of that jazz. And that's when the study was officially ended. Public outrage led to new regulations like better informed consent, institutional review boards, and a greater scrutiny of studies involving vulnerable populations, right? What else was happening in 1972? Boy, oh boy. A little thing called Watergate. Watergate was happening in 1972. So this is also possibly why a lot of people were not paying attention to what was happening in Tuskegee. And also, I mean this as respectfully and honestly as possible. The country usually doesn't really care about what's happening to poor Black people in rural areas. It doesn't affect them, so they don't care, right? Also, fun fact, Ehrlichman, his son, goes to my mom's church. And it's taken everything in me not to go up to him and be like, I need to talk to you about your dad. But again, that's neither here nor there. What else was happening in 72? We had a lot of veterans coming back from Vietnam and participating in protests. What also happened in 72 was the Munich Olympics, where some folks, lost their lives in a massacre. So 72 was just bananas and pajamas, and that's just at the high level, right? So again, we know that Tuskegee was acknowledged by President Clinton, the class action lawsuit for $10 million, which seems so small compared to what these men went through, and not a single person was ever charged. I mean, they literally put out a report that was like the 30th anniversary of the Tuskegee syphilis study of untreated whatever. And it's like, why would you do that to somebody? But again, because we don't deem these people as being worth adequate healthcare or fair healthcare, then nobody really pays attention to what happens and there's no consequences. So, of course, President Clinton offered a formal apology, and this is him with Herman Shaw, who was one of the victims of the study. And the last participant passed away in 2004 at 96 years old. He, along with his brother Louis, Ernest and Louis, thank goodness, were in the control group, and he was able to live a fairly healthy life. But not everybody was so lucky. So we're going to kind of close off the presentation part and get ready to enter into the discussion part with Dr. Uche Blackstock. Again, she's talking about this book, which I highly recommend for folks. And she also talks about what happens in medical school and some of the things that you're taught in medical school that can help fortify some of the biases that we may not even realize that we have. So we're going to listen to Dr. Blackstock and then go from there.
Dr. Blackstock, thanks for joining us. I love the title, Legacy, because there are really two legacies that run through this book. I want to start with the family legacy. Your mother was what was very rare in the 80s and 90s, a Black female physician. How did watching her work, seeing her go to work every day, and actually seeing her at work, how did that affect your decision to become a physician? We should mention your twin sister is also a physician.
Well, obviously, she was a huge influence on us. She had a very different upbringing than we did. She was born in poverty and public assistance, the first person in her family to graduate from college, and then she went to medical school, Harvard Medical School. Then she came back after medical school to practice in the community in which she grew up in. And so that was a powerful message for us that, you go and, you get a great education and you come back and bring those resources back and you help those that are your family and neighbors. And that's exactly what she did. And she would get together with other Black women physicians in our community and hold community health fairs, really to help out the folks who lived in our neighborhood. And I love that message that she sent to us.
Your mother died relatively young. She was 47. She died of leukemia. And also you had an experience that you detail in the book where you had appendicitis that was misdiagnosed and became very, very serious. Your appendix burst. Do you think the outcomes or the treatment might have been different if you weren't Black women?
I think it's very, very likely, and it's not just because of my own anecdotal experiences. It's because we have a lot of data that shows when Black people, when women, when Black women go to seek care, often their concerns are ignored, dismissed, or minimized. When I had appendicitis, I was a first-year medical student, and I went to the ER 3 times. My appendix ended up rupturing. I had long-term complications. I had to be out of school for a month. And after that happened, I looked back and said, would that have happened if I wasn't a young Black woman? I have to think that the fact that I was a Black woman really impacted how I was cared for.
The first physician you saw in the emergency room underestimated your pain. She said, this can't be appendicitis. She's not in that much pain.
Exactly. And that's something that we see a thread in terms of how that Black patients are cared for. There is something called pain inequity, where we have seen a trend, and it's in the research, that Black patients, their pain is often undertreated. And that connects to really deep-rooted systemic beliefs back from slavery days, that somehow we are biologically different, that we feel pain differently than other people do.
Leads me perfectly into my next question. The two legacies sort of come together. Yes. At Harvard Medical School. You and your sister with your mother became the first mother-daughters graduates from Harvard.
Yes.
But you also write about things that are taught in medical school as fact that date back to the 19th century or to Jim Crow. Talk about some of those things.
Yeah, and I talk about this idea that whether explicitly or implicitly in medical school, we're taught this idea that our patients who are Black are biologically different. So for example, there's something that is called the race correction factor that is associated with assessing or measuring kidney function. And for a very long time, up until very recently, there was a different set of normal values for Black patients and non-Black patients. And that was based on this myth, this idea that Black people had higher muscle mass, which somehow translated into a different set of normal values for kidney function. But anyway, what that has led to is Black people being deferred to or having delayed specialty care for their kidneys or not placed on transplant lists. So these ideas that are deeply rooted that we are taught in school actually end up having detrimental impact on our patients.
And it's also the sort of institutional racism or systemic racism also has had an effect on the number of Black physicians.
Yes, and so I write about in the book the Flexner Report, which came out in 1910, that was actually commissioned by the American Medical Association and Carnegie Mellon Foundation. They sent an educational specialist, Abraham Flexner, to assess all of the medical schools in the US and Canada and to hold them against the standards of Western European medical schools, or in the US, Johns Hopkins. And that led to the closure of 5 out of 7 of the historically Black colleges and universities that up to that point had trained about 1,600 students. But it's estimated if those 5 medical schools at the turn of the century, those Black medical schools had stayed open, they would have trained between 25,000 and 35,000 Black physicians. That is such a tremendous loss, not only in the workforce, but the patients they could have treated, the students they could have mentored, the research that could have been done.
Yeah, that's a lot, right? That's a lot. I wanted to end with that because it ties everything together, right? If we are not cautious and paying attention to the ways in which bias shows up in these little moments, it can have really, really detrimental effects. And so the goal is not to get offended when somebody comes in and is asking all these extra questions. What we need to remember is you don't know what experiences that person has had, nor the experiences that person's family members have had that are causing them to be cautious. And so a lot of times you can just ask, right? Like, hey, what's going on? Like, what are some of those concerns that you have? And let's figure them out together. A lot of times it's not personal. A lot of times they're just trying to protect themselves. So as we are thinking about, all that we have talked about today, I just want to know if folks want to unmute or, use the raise hand function, if there are any questions, or folks want to kind of poke at some of these. Was there something that surprised you today that was unsettling or completely new, or you're just like, I don't even understand what to do with this information? And also with the history you got acquainted today, have you been able to think about some hindrances to rebuilding trust in the medical community, that you would also like to share? No right or wrong answers. Remember that. I'm gonna put the questions well, I was gonna put the questions in the chat, but I'm sharing my screen. Yeah, please feel free to unmute, use the raise hand function. I'm going to stop sharing just real quick so that we can see more of each other, and see, so I can see the chat better and see if folks have anything that they want to share about what we talked about today so far. And then I'll put the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I wanted to share the slide on the eugenics thinking where it mentioned the idea that these feeble-minded children, it would be better to make sure they're not born than to execute them later because we're just assuming they're going to be criminals. I've heard similar rhetoric in modern day in about a lot of different countries and their children. And so, like you were saying, history really repeats itself. So I think this history is really important to learn where it leads.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just, happening here, it's happening all over the place, right? I've heard folks say that if you are, poor and you can't afford to have children, you shouldn't have children, which is a slippery slope, right? I don't have children. One, I don't want to push a whole human out of my body. I think that's still very strange. I
Yes.
Childbirth is awesome. And also I'm good. Like you got to grow bones, a whole human inside your body.
Mm,
I can't. And also, you telling somebody that their poverty is their fault because something that they did or their family members did is so unfair, because then you're not looking at the structural reasons why this person doesn't have access to resources, right? We keep cutting and cutting and cutting funding for resources, and then you're going to blame the person for not having access to the resources. Or similarly, again, this is just my personal opinion, right? If you are going to say that you are pro-life over pro-choice, then why aren't you also talking about the life that the child would have after they are brought into this world? So it's more than just, the care of the child. It's really about deciding who gets to have children and who doesn't, right? And
mhm.
that is where eugenics gets to be real slippery. On the flip side, there are positive things about eugenics, right? You can do genetic sequencing and all that. I tell you a little lore. When I was in 10th grade, I was a super nerd. Okay. When I say super nerd, I'm a super nerd. I was doing genetic testing at UW with graduate students. I was doing electrophoresis projects, trying to figure out, the connection between sickle cell and malaria. I was bored. I mean, these are grad students and they were like, why is this child here? But understanding the importance of genetic testing and sequencing can be great. And also know any medical advancement can also be used for harm. And so you really have to check your biases if you're working in an environment where your biases can cause, unknowingly or knowingly, you to not have the best bedside manner for the people that you're engaging with. And a lot of times once you check yourself, you're like, okay, I have this bias now. Now, what do I do about it is the most important part. And we all have biases, myself included. So, this is not like, oh, you're a bad person because you have biases. Once you acknowledge them, then it's like, okay, what can I change because of the way that we were all socialized. So yeah, that is. And please, can you please let me know how to pronounce your name?
Bernali.
Renali. Okay. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for that. Yeah.
Thank
If
you.
anybody has any other thoughts, please, this is my bread and butter. I am about to go I can nerd out on this stuff all day.
I mean, I have a comment. I found a lot to be disturbing, just because a lot of it I didn't know. I don't know if I just wasn't paying attention in history as well as I should have, or if some of it just actually was never taught to me. But some of the things that really stood out was the fitter families. I thought that was I'd never heard of that, and so that was new to me. But I guess one of the things that kind of kept coming back to me was how it relates to healthcare and what we're currently doing. And a lot of the overwhelming themes that I saw between a lot of what you shared was this lack of trust that's been created over the years and kind of what we could do, in our current roles to kind of combat that or maybe build back some of that trust. And so, some of the things that I think would be really important would be, just being as transparent as we can when possible. But definitely a lot to date that was very shocking. But it is sad to see the lack of trust in healthcare, and it would be nice to take this as an opportunity to figure out what we can do in our jobs every day to kind of maybe build that back just a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tyler. I see that the room with all the folks has a hand up. And I just want to say to Tyler's point, the thing that I would like for all of you to take away, if you take nothing else away from this onslaught of information, you need to understand that a lot of times it's not personal. It's not personal. It is because of all of the things that we have been taught, all of the ways we have seen our family members treated, and situations like Tuskegee, right? My mother has a thick, beautiful accent. We're from Kenya, and I go with her to her doctor's appointments because as soon as somebody hears an accent, sometimes she doesn't get the best care. And so I then speak up and they're like, oh, okay, cool. She's quote unquote one of us. So again, I don't know you, you don't know me, but the ways in which we interact with folks sometimes can cause us to be a little, a little skittish. So I just want you all to think about that and kind of try to wonder, again, using curiosity as your lightsaber, I wonder why this person is having this response rather than, oh my God, I can't believe this person is having a response. Just a change in perspective can make it easier for both sides to engage. Hi, big room of people. Dr. Charlie, is that you?
Hi, AJ. Yes, it is. I'm going to mute.
No, we're not.
Can you hear me, AJ?
Yep, I can hear you.
Awesome. Great presentation as always. And I wanted to share with the entire group that if you think this isn't happening right now as we speak, 3 weeks ago in the House of Representatives, there was a bill introduced, HR 3518, by a Representative Greg Murphy from North Carolina, co-sponsored by 15 other Republicans across the country, that would tell medical schools across the country that if they taught this exact lecture that you just did, anything like this, anything having to do with DEI, they are at risk for losing all federal funding, all grants, all student loans, all federal programs. So the current administration is trying to suppress this exact knowledge and therefore suppress the idea that we can look at medicine with this lens, this thoughtful lens about how patients come to us with different life experiences and how we need to respect that and learn about it. So if you wish to get involved, it's HR 3518. You can Google search it. You can figure out ways to contact your representatives and other folks in the administration and in Congress and say that this may not be something that we think is a good thing. Because it's, as you said, history repeats itself, and it's repeating itself right now by trying to suppress information exactly like you did today.
Thanks for that, Dr. Charlie. 100%. 100%. I see a hand up from Juan, I believe.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering, I had a question. I was wondering what your opinions were on how AI is being more integrated in healthcare nowadays. Do you think that these AI models will be able to help take away the bias that is in healthcare, or do you think they add to it?
As respectfully as I can, AI adds to it because the people who are developing AI also have biases, and there's not enough Black and brown people, immigrant folks who are working in AI to help shape it and shape the narrative. So again, the person who is creating the programming, if they have unchecked bias, then it becomes really difficult for them to create a product that also does not have that same bias in it. And so what I try to tell Black and brown folks is get more involved in AI. If you got a kid who is super into tech, get them into AI because then you are getting more representation in the foundational moments of building the thing, right? So using the Constitution, for example, because anyway, we don't need to know what I was watching earlier, but using the Constitution as an example, when the Constitution was written, it was not written with Black folks, with immigrants, with anybody except for white land owning men in mind, right? So then the rest of everything that comes out of the Constitution ends up being tainted by that because we're not even using positive language in the Constitution. It's telling you what you can't do, not what you can do. So you take that kind of theory and you put it to AI, you put it to medicine, you put it to anything, and you start to see the biases of the person leak out, whether they mean to or not. So AI can be very helpful, but because of technology gaps where you have folks who don't even have access to consistent Wi-Fi, it becomes something that is more scary to somebody who's not familiar with it than something that can be deemed as helpful, right? For example, if you have any seasoned older folks in your life, right? How many times have they asked you how to use your phone, right? My mom calls me on FaceTime to ask me how to do something on her phone, right? So then imagine her trying to use AI, right? It's not that she's not brilliant. It's just like us millennial kids grew up with this technology, so it's easier for us to get involved. So what I would say is there are definitely benefits for AI always. And also remember, as you are working with this, that if you are able to, I would check into the developer, see how diverse they are. If the developer is not as diverse, then no, you are going to need to shore up the AI, right? The AI becomes a helpful tool, but you as the main person are the one who really is responsible for putting the person at ease. And a lot of that is usually just, I don't know this technology thing. I watched Terminator and this AI robot is not finna get me. I saw what happened in in iRobot with Will Smith. And so it's like those kinds of things pop into your head because they don't have any other experience with it. So that's my opinion. Yeah, I would leave it there.
Thank you so much.
Of course, that's an excellent question. I love it.
Yeah, I'd love to add on to that with a case study because I know of a situation where there was an AI supposed to use pictures to figure out if someone had or was at risk of melanoma or should see a doctor about their melanoma, and it did not work on brown skin because the AI was trained on only white skin. So you see a lot of that. It's not just about how diverse the developer is, but what has this AI been trained on? It was basically what you were saying.
Yep, exactly, exactly. So again, these tools that seem helpful for one community may not even seem helpful for another community. I'll give you also another very, very simple example. When folks are donating things to homeless shelters and stuff, you tend to donate stuff that you use. If the demographics at the homeless shelter does not match you, right? If let's say Dr. Charlie has some shampoo that he wants to donate to me, right? Dr. Charlie's hair and my hair are two completely different hair. So he may give me a product that he's like, this stuff works really well on me. And I would look at him and be like, Dr. Charlie, you and I don't have the same type of hair, right? It's no beef. There's no issue. It's just we have different types of hair. And so if you aren't thinking about what this person may need and how their needs may be different than you, literally because of their genetic makeup, then you need to start thinking intersectionally is what we're saying, right? We need to start thinking about people's experiences outside of these 1-2 occurrences that we have with each other in these fleeting moments. But yes, that is absolutely correct. So I want to be respectful of time, even though I can have this conversation for forever. And I just want to kind of close out with some ways that we can counter these very specific eugenics-like thinking, right? So we can create ways to protect everyone's right to make their own reproductive choices. We're seeing that being challenged right now with the removal of rural clinics and stuff. Folks are not getting access. Also, we did not codify Roe into law. So here we are. Claiming that women are too emotional. A lot of times that's why I have a Black lady doctor, because I don't want to have to explain why I'm talking in a certain tone of voice, but I'm not actually really mad. I'm just frustrated. Okay. Listening and believing your patient about their pain. A lot of times, most Black folks will rather suffer in silence. At least I know my mom would rather suffer in silence until I then call her doctors, because I'm good friends with all of her doctors at this point. And so you have to listen to the patient. And a lot of times, again, patients bring somebody else with them to help them advocate for themselves. It's not that they think that you're a bad provider. They just want to make sure that they are able to get the care that they need. And then we also need to value disabled people. Disabled people have just as much of a right to live full, whole, happy, healthy lives. You work with them, find out what they're comfortable with, and then get them assistance on anything else that they can't do. It doesn't have to be something super crazy, but that person has the ability to explain. Should they have the ability to explain to you what they need, believe them and go with that. And so I want to stop here with some of the resources that you guys are going to have access to. The eugenics documentary is on YouTube for folks to watch. I highly recommend this National Library of Science website if you really read more about the Tuskegee Study and kind of get a timeline of it, including photographs. It's excellent. And then last year in January, the Smithsonian Magazine did a kind of had a bunch of digitized records from the Tuskegee study that folks can look through. I also highly, highly, highly recommend that you check out the Freedmen's Bureau website. I used to volunteer as a transcriber for the Freedmen's Bureau, transcribing all of the letters and helping digitize the letters that folks had sent back and forth. I love a good podcast. American Scandal is hosted by a man named Lindsey A. Graham, not that Lindsey Graham, a different Lindsey Graham, and it is excellent. It's just like a radio show. And it's like 4 or 5 episodes per topic. They have topics on everything. Highly recommend. And then for our next session together, which will be in August, we're going to talk about the care divide, how big ideas met unequal realities. So our third session together will explore how inequitable practices shaped the structure of American healthcare in the 80s and 90s, including blocking universal healthcare coverage, reinforcing health disparities, and deepening mistrust. From underfunding of AIDS care to forced sterilizations and state-level Medicare discrimination, this session is going to connect the dots between the historical injustices and today's public health crisis, and we'll ponder together who gets access to fair and adequate health care, and how do we build a system where everyone is meant to survive.